All right. Welcome. All right. Welcome everybody to this evening's repair presentation. I'm Jenny Laughlin. I'm one of the members of the repair organizing committee. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, and of course to our panelists, Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., Kathy Kaufman, and Mayo Bartlett. Repair stands for Rivertowns Episcopal Parishes Action on Inclusion and Race. For those of you who have been with us for a while, some of these upcoming slides will be familiar. Repair is a faith-based organization whose mission is to work for healing and justice. We seek opportunities for active engagement to address racial and economic injustice, both on our own and in partnership with other organizations in our communities. We support our work through education and dialogue in an atmosphere of mutual respect. Just wanted to put a note here that says, to say that while we are a faith-based effort and a collaboration among the Episcopal churches in the Rivertowns, we welcome people of all faiths and those who don't adhere to any faith tradition at all. So thank you again for being here. Bottom line, all are welcome. Next. Repair respectfully acknowledges the ancestral homelands that we are upon here in Westchester County of the Lenape and other related tribes in the Rivertowns region from Dobbs Ferry to Peekskill and beyond. We recognize their ongoing cultural and spiritual connection to this land, past, present, and future. Our group norms are to listen, to understand, and not to convince. We ask that people speak from their own experience, share the stage, lean into discomfort. Some of the topics that come up in these conversations are, create a little discomfort, and we embrace that. Participate to the fullest of your ability. Please honor confidentiality. Obviously, things that are concepts that are talked about here, we encourage you to talk about in the broader community. That's what it's about. But if people are sharing personal stories, we ask that you keep them in the room, as it were, our digital room here. Ask for do-over if you realize your words were inelegant. This is a brave space, just say it. In terms of our rules of the road, if you have a question or a comment, there's a repair leader. Tonight it's Lee who will be watching the chat window on Zoom. Thanks, Lee, for doing that. So everybody, please feel free to write your questions or comments in the chat, and Lee will be monitoring those and forwarding them at the time for question and answer. To reduce background noise, your microphone is muted until a moderator calls on you if we have an opportunity for that. And we recommend setting your Zoom page to speaker view to better follow the discussion, especially with a presentation like tonight's. So we ask you to take a moment now to center yourself for this evening's conversation. In our faith tradition, one of the ways we do that is through prayer. In a moment, I'm going to ask Gareth Evans, the rector of St. Barnabas in Irvington, to lead us in an opening prayer. After that, he'll be turning the program over to Carl, who will introduce our conversation tonight, Police Reform in Westchester, a community conversation. And Carl will introduce our speakers and get the conversation going. So thank you. Thanks again for being here. And Gareth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Let us pray. God of divine justice and love, we ask your blessing upon our gathering this night as we reflect upon the times we live in, the call for racial justice and equity, and the call for greater accountability and transparency in the law enforcement communities across our great nation. We ask you to particularly safeguard and protect African Americans and Latinos from stereotyping and targeting. We pray that our conversation may heighten our awareness of your love and your deep call for justice in this area of our nation's life. We pray that we may discern your spirit of healing and your call for renewal. We ask all of this in your holy name. And so we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Gareth. I'm Carl Weber, another member of the organizing committee. By the way, I assume you can all hear me, correct? Okay, very good. And I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing tonight's panelists and our topic, which is police reform in Westchester. And many of you may remember that repair actually originated about 5 years ago in a series of Lenten conversations about race, which were held in the pre-Easter season by the leaders of 5 Episcopal churches here in the Rivertowns. And one of the driving forces behind our desire to convene those Lenten conversations about race was the fact that our nation had suffered through a series of police killings, and some of the names that we invoked in the flyers that we distributed to invite people to our Lenten conversations about race in the spring of 2015 were names like Eric Garner and Michael Brown. Mm-hmm. We remember those names to this day, and sadly, since then, in some ways, it feels as though not much has changed. We still have names that we need to remember and honor. Now we have names like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and sadly, almost every month seems to bring another name or two that of people whose names we need to remember and whose deaths we need to think about. And yet, in some ways, it seems as though a lot has changed in the 5 years since 2015. The problem remains, and yet it seems, and we have our fingers crossed as we say this, that perhaps the national awareness and concern about the problem has increased. A group that 5 years ago was viewed by many as being on the fringe of American society, Black Lives Matter, has since gone mainstream, and major organizations from the world of business and sports and entertainment have openly endorsed it, which is something that many of us did not predict was possible. Racial inequality has now risen during 2020 to near the top of the national agenda at last, where it needs to be, along with issues like the COVID pandemic. And during the political campaign of 2020, someone needs to mute, I think. During the 2020 political campaign, one of the most hotly debated themes, controversial and often misunderstood, was this new motto of defund the police. And perhaps some of our panelists tonight will talk a little bit about what that means to them and how all of us should interpret that. And one other thing on a more local level that has changed in the last 5 years is that our Governor Cuomo issued a mandate to police departments throughout the state that they need to adopt a plan for police reform by April 1st of this year, 2021, to be eligible for future state funding. Again, the kind of step that many of us were hoping for, but which we might not have thought possible until now. So it's about time we have this discussion here at Repair. We've been working for a few months to try to pull together the right kind of panel, and I feel so fortunate that we've been able to get 3 very distinguished, knowledgeable, deeply engaged people with different perspectives that they can offer on what police reform should mean and what we can do to contribute to it. Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., Kathy Kaufman, and Mayo Bartlett. And I'm going to introduce them one by one as they each speak. So let me start with Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., who's going to speak first. And what we're going to do this evening is we're going to ask each of our panelists to present their background and some of their big thoughts about police reform. We'll ask each panelist to try to restrict themselves to 15 minutes so we can get all 3 panelists in. And after the 3 panelists are finished, then we'll be taking Q&A from all the rest of our participants. So please, as you listen to the panelists, be going into the chat room at the bottom of your screen and type in whatever question or comment you might have. We will have a couple of our organizing committee members monitoring the chat, and after the panelists are completed, we'll get through to as many of your comments and questions as we possibly can. So please make use of the chat in that way. So let me start by introducing Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., whose work is as a work experience program developer with the Urban League of Westchester County. Important work, but even more important for our purposes is the work that he does on behalf of police reform. And it began when he was forced to respond to his father's death at the hands of White Plains police officers in November of 2011. Since then, Kenneth has been one of the powerful voices for positive change in Westchester County and in New York State. He's one of the founding members of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, which consists of community organizations, religious institutions, and individuals who share a vision of safe communities with improved community police relations and greater police accountability and transparency. And when he's asked why he does this work, Kenneth responds, "You want for your brother and sister that which you want for yourself." And when I say brother and sister, I mean all people, because one's works are more important than one's skin color. So Kenneth, thank you very much for your work and for being here with us tonight. And please kick off our evening with a brief explanation of yourself, what you're doing, and how you got involved, and why this mission of police reform is so important.
Well, good evening, everyone. I definitely want to thank you for allowing me to come before you this evening to even have the discussion about police reform. What I find is that even when the thought of reform, I guess, so when we talk about policing, sometimes brings about a negative connotation. And I mean, when reality, I've said time and time again that reform only simply means to change into an improved form of condition. And that's what we're trying to do. And we do that by working together. We do that with this, I guess, a collective impact, working together, sharing information. So I'm definitely happy to come before you today, because some people I know on here, some people I don't, but the networking is what's important. And what I'd like to do, I guess, is share a little bit about what I have experienced, I guess, since the killing of my father. So you can get an idea of what happened with him and all that my family and I have gone through for almost 10 years now. And I will definitely say before I speak that anything or any information pertaining to the killing of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. is available through Freedom of Information. Because sometimes when I begin to speak about these things, people can't believe it. They're like, no, that couldn't happen. That couldn't have happened. But yes, it actually did. And I like to consider myself to be an open book when I talk about what happened to my dad. So I'll just say, I'll just ask that you guys kind of just take a walk with me right now and imagine without intention, you activated your medical alarm device that you wore around your neck. This device you have on because you suffer from health conditions that could potentially kill you if you don't get immediate attention. Imagine in the early morning, you're awakened by a loud banging on your door, and you go to the door and it's police officers at your door. You tell them that you're fine, you didn't call them, but they insist on gaining entry into your apartment. Now, we know that, or if you don't know, there are 3 circumstances in which a law enforcement officer can come into your home. Permission, you gave them consent. A warrant, which is a written order that authorizes a person or a law enforcement officer to perform a search on you or on your premises, or exigent circumstances, where that would be cause that a reasonable person, or in this case, a reasonable officer, would believe that entry into the premises was necessary to prevent physical harm to another individual. These police officers actually had none of that. And my father knew that. And because he would not let them in for over 90 minutes, they would bang on his door. They would yell at him. They would scream at him. They would mock his military service. At one point, he tells the officers that he's okay, and you can hear an officer use an expletive and the N-word. They said, "I don't give an F," and then use the N-word and demand that he open the door. They eventually take the door off his hinges. They fire an electronic taser at him, a beanbag shotgun 4 times, and then they fire live ammunition at him, shooting him, killing him, and alleging that he posed an imminent threat to life or well-being. The Westchester County District Attorney at the time was Janet DeFiore, who is now the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals for the state of New York. She promised a full and fair investigation into the events that led to the death of my father, but in May of 2012, she came back with no true bill, no indictment in his killing. A reporter asked Janet DeFiore at that time, "Well, what about the N-word that was hurled at Mr. Chamberlain moments before his death?" She didn't deny its use, but she justified it. She said that it was used as a tactic to distract my father. I'll say that again, because I know when I say this, a lot of people say, "Did I hear him correctly?" Yes, you did. She said that the racial slur that was used moments before my father was killed is used as a tactic to distract. So following the no true bill on the county level, the U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara announced that he was going to look at the case for civil rights violations. Now, when I heard that, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is a no-brainer. They used the N-word, then they killed him. It's on audio. The DA didn't deny its use. So there has to be a civil rights violation. Wrong. In November 2016, was it 2016? I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. No, in 2018, I'm sorry. The then acting attorney June Kim for the Second Circuit, for the Southern District, announced that there was insufficient evidence to move forward for civil rights violations. But at the same time, we filed the civil suit. Now, most people think that when we file a civil suit, cities will try to put this narrative out there that, oh, the families are just out to get money, when that's not the case. What this does is it allows our attorneys to now ask the questions that may or may not have been asked on a local level. And we find out a lot of different information. But as we move forward in that particular situation, the judge at that time threw out the meat of our case and narrowed it down to the final seconds where the police officer pulled the trigger. So in 2016, our civil suit was rejected. The jury found for the city of White Plains. We appealed that decision. And in June of last year, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals restored some of our claims. So we're back in court now. And I'm happy about that. And there's really not much more that I can say about that because we are currently in court right now. And I can't really speak about what's actually taking place in court. But you've heard that since then, I helped co-found the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. I am also a member of an organization called Families United for Justice. Families United for Justice are families throughout the United States that have loved ones that have been killed by law enforcement officers. And I myself currently serve on the Westchester County Executive George Latimer's Police Reform and Reimagining Task Force. Now, when we talk about these task forces. Or I guess let me first say, I tell people, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, you hear people say that, but I tell people there is a difference between being part of a movement and following a movement. And because you put a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, does not mean that you are part of a movement. That means that you are following it. That means that it is trending. And this is, so you're putting this hashtag. So yes, we talk about the fact that Governor Cuomo has signed some bills into law. What he called the most aggressive police reform package ever. He signed executive orders. But what I'm finding is that many of these cities, towns, and villages, some have yet to even have their first meeting. And some that do have meetings, the decks are stacked against the people who are really trying to affect positive change out there. So it forces me to draw this conclusion that when you see these elected officials saying Black Lives Matter, they are not saying it because they necessarily believe that. They are saying it because it is politically advantageous, that they want your vote, and that if they have not learned anything else during this election, they understand the power of the vote now. And this is why it's so very important that we come together collectively to try to force change or affect positive change. When people ask me about the justice system on a whole, I give the analogy of the Matrix. I'm not sure how many of you have ever seen that movie, but it starred Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. And Lawrence Fishburne was speaking to Keanu Reeves in this movie, and he said, you can swallow the blue pill or you can swallow the red pill. He said, if you swallow the blue pill, the story ends here. You wake up in the morning, you believe what you want to believe. But if you swallow the red pill, you'll stay in Wonderland, and I'll show you just how deep the rabbit hole can get. I'm only offering the truth. And this is what we see when it comes to affecting positive change in the area of police reform. I have been in a decade-long fight. You have cities like the city of White Plains. You have a mayor out here, Mayor Roach, who will walk around and he will tell you that Black Lives Matter, that he believes in the rule of law. And yet, you're still fighting my family in court. That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't add up. You're still trying to make my father look like a suspect rather than the victim that he was and is. So this is why I draw the comparison of the Matrix. I say we're in the Matrix. That what we're seeing is an illusion of a fair system because many people have chosen to take the blue pill, even with the current climate, and they have not awakened to the real reality of taking the red pill. So this is why when I was asked to come before you guys and speak, I didn't want to pass this opportunity up because, like I said, it's going to take collective work. We're going to have to attack these systems at the same time. All of these cities, towns, and villages, we have to kind of hit them simultaneously and force this change because, as you hear some elected officials say, don't just ask me for it, make me do it. And this is what we have to do. And this is what I see. You know, being part of this task force have opened my eyes to a lot of different things. I'm on the accountability committee, and we have some good people on that, in that committee, who really are trying to do the work. And we were getting extremely frustrated because we're looking at some of the changes that we want, but then we're saying, is there legislation that's going to block it? So what it's really going to take in the end, and I'm sure that, you know, maybe Mayo will probably speak a little more in detail about this, is that it will take legislation to really force the change that we need to see happen. It's going to take that. We can have oversight, and, you know, the county, we're putting our recommendations together. I don't think that it makes sense to have 43 different oversight bodies. I think that we should have one. I think that all the cities, towns, and villages should buy in to the one county oversight committee that we're trying to put together, that we've kind of affectionately named the Office of Police Accountability. We talked about ways that we might be able to make that happen. And the way that that can happen is the people in the different cities, towns, and villages speaking to your elected officials where you live at, and tell them that you want them to buy into the recommendations that the county is going to put out. And I think that if they see us all on the same page with this, then it can work. One of the things that I talked about many years ago after my father was killed, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 years after, was I spoke about the fact that we have these police officers in Westchester County. They are trained at the Westchester County Police Academy, and then they go to their respective cities, towns, and villages where they're going to police at. Once they go there, they're given an entirely different set of rules. That makes no sense. This is where the problem lies. There's no consistency. So since they are all Westchester County police officers, they all train at the Westchester County Police Academy. Why do they not just be Westchester County police officers and have precincts just like the NYPD, and the rules and the policies are consistent straight across the board?
Kenneth, one more minute, okay?
Okay. So the best example I can give with that very quickly is, I always give the body camera policy. The body camera policy in one city says, whenever an officer makes a stop, the camera comes on immediately. In another city, it'll say it's at the discretion of the officer. This is why we have to have some type of consistency. So I'm going to stop there. I didn't think I could actually do 15 minutes, but I guess because, you know, Mayo Bartlett is my friend and I hang around him all the time, he's taught me how to talk. So no, I want to thank you guys though for listening to me, and any questions that you have, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Kenneth, thank you. I don't know if you learned it from Bartlett, but you certainly know how to talk. And thank you for taking, thank you for taking something terrible that happened in your family and beginning to make something good out of it for our whole society. We appreciate that very much, and your being here. Let me introduce our second panelist, Kathy Kaufman. She's a sociologist and data analyst who lives in Irvington, New York. She received her doctor's degree in sociology from Columbia in 2000. And since then, she's worked on large-scale data collection and research projects related to a wide range of topics, especially criminal justice, policing, and public safety. She's a member of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, the Westchester County Criminal Justice Advisory Board, and the advisory board of the Coming Home Reentry Program based in White Plains. And her recent work includes the creation of the Westchester County Policing Budget Dashboard, the Police Money in Politics Dashboard, and a report examining racial disparities in marijuana possession arrests in Westchester County. And Kathy is a member of the Irvington Town Committee on Police Reform. So we're delighted to hear from Kathy tonight and get her perspective on police reform based on the things that she's learned as someone both studying the issue and now working in it. Kathy.
Thanks for introducing me. I guess I should say, I don't know if it was on there, that I'm also a member of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform.
Yes.
So hi, everybody. It's really nice to see so many faces, and I can, of course, only see 1/3 of you at a time. I don't have the full picture, but I kind of wanted to just start out by asking if people would raise their hand or signal if they are on their local police reform task force under the governor's executive order, or is mine, except I can't see my hand. I guess I'll scroll through and see who else is. I'm curious as to see, so Jordan, great. Well, I'm glad to see so many people are involved in those committees, and I didn't know how, how much hands-on information you're interested in, but I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into this kind of, became interested in this kind of thing. I guess, effectively I took is it the blue pill or the red pill? I'm not sure. I guess I took the pill.
Red. The red
pill. I was wandering around. I've lived in Irvington for about 25 years, and really, felt pretty much like I was living in Mayberry, just like the most idyllic village, and love all my neighbors. And I participated in a bunch of local committees on, reorganizing the playgrounds and the PTSA and things like that. And I guess about 5 years ago, my daughter came home from school and told me that her teacher, that she had sort of heard through the grapevine, that one of her teachers had some kind of bad, very bad, just difficult, disturbing experience with the Irvington police. And since she was in high school, I didn't rely on her for details, but I reached out to him and I asked if he would talk to me about it. And it actually took him a while to get back to me. And when he did, we had a very disturbing conversation in which he described, he's a Hispanic man, very slight, and described a situation in which he was parked behind a restaurant in Irvington. He wasn't able to find parking. It was a Saturday night, and went back to his car with his friend after dinner, and he has a very old car, so he was sitting there waiting for his car to warm up, and the police pulled up and flashed and apparently the parking lot was quite full, like a lot of other people had done the same thing, and the police shined a light in his window, raised their voices, demanded they get out of the car, yelled at them, said that, accused him of being drunk. He became very anxious. He was shaking, and he began to look for the receipt from his restaurant meal to show that he hadn't had wine, although he wasn't driving. He was sitting warming up a car, and asked him to empty his pockets. The partner he was with emptied his pocket, and there was one of those little plastic bags with a button. He had a new suit on, took the button out, and the police officer took it and said, "Aha!" And eventually they searched the car without asking for consent, which happens quite frequently, actually, because I don't know if you've ever noticed, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation with a police officer where they might say, would you open your glove compartment? And we don't typically say no, or may I look in your bag, right? We don't typically say no. So that's search without consent. And they searched his car. When they didn't find anything, they said, okay, good night, bye. And he was so disturbed and so anxious and so freaked out that he said he was never, ever going to come back to Irvington again. This is from all the way in Dobbs Ferry, right? And I was so ashamed and so stunned that this had happened in a village where I've lived so long, which had happened effectively with my support as a taxpayer, with our civic oversight as I'm a voter, and that I had never known that such a thing could happen. And I guess my feeling about it was, that for so many years, I'd heard terrible stories about things that happened to people, but I never thought they happened here in the Rivertowns. And that was shattering to me. And so my first reaction was because I'm a sociologist and I do look at data. And I'm also somebody who's very skeptical of anything that I don't have a lot of evidence around, was to say, to go look at the research in the area and find out how I can get more data to see if this was a pattern of racial profiling, if it was maybe an anomaly. And so I went online and I found a whole bunch of research studies around, and this was not my field of expertise, by the way. I was doing research on other things before that. And I found some studies that identified the minimum data set you need to identify a pattern in racial profiling, and put together a little FOIL request and walked the 2 blocks to my local police department and dropped off the FOIL request. And it was the first FOIL request I've ever submitted in my life. And turned around and walked out. And as I was walking down the street, I guess I got about half a block and my cell phone rang. And it was my local police chief, who I'd never met. And he said, who the hell do you think you are? Who do you think you are? You have absolutely no right. You have no right to do what you're doing. This is a witch hunt. It's inappropriate. It would be illegal for one of my data, some of the data I was asking for were the records of police stops that had, and the race and ethnicity of the people who were stopped. And he said, it would be illegal for us to even collect that information. We actually, law precludes us from even recording that. And I will never, ever honor this request. So I'm actually a very thin-skinned person, or I guess I was 5 years ago. I didn't cry, which I think is good, but I did go home and kind of shake for a while. And I thought, okay, well, I know by law, he has to, that this has to be honored, but I don't know what I'll get. And I went home, and I guess exactly 10 days later, which is the maximum time frame for which you have to honor a FOIL request, I received what was basically a ream of blank paper. It was a big piece of computer printout that had a bunch of very vague records, sometimes a location, very little else, no race, no ethnicity. And what I found out later is that the police department in my village doesn't actually collect any information on stops that don't result in an arrest or a ticket or a violation. And so there was nothing in the blotter. So many years later, I now know that, in fact, you can go to the New York State's Department of Criminal Justice Services, and actually quite a lot of information is available, including demographic information on people who are arrested by municipality, and for every municipality in the state of New York, including every village, town, and city. We still don't have data on people who aren't arrested. But that was sort of my introduction to the magnitude of the institutional obstacles to even knowing fundamentally what's happening in our towns and villages with our taxpayer money, and with our effective volition and consent. So I guess, so that was, you know, it's been a very long 5 years. And since then, I guess I've sort of made it my business to just, I felt like I could not continue to live in my village if I didn't continue to push to have this fixed. I felt morally compromised every day from that moment onward. I also, to be fair, I'm not a saint. Like, actually, my first reaction was, oh no, people will find out that we're a racist village, and no one will come to our restaurants. Okay, so that was my first white lady reaction. But things have changed a lot since then. And I guess what I found is that this is a very difficult and intransigent system on many, many levels. And I have to be honest, I never thought I'd see the day that I would be on an Irvington police reform panel or task force, because for about 4 or 5 years, as I think Laura Seaman can attest, I talked about this ad nauseum, and nobody found it that interesting. I do feel more hopeful. I feel like we are, you know, that people, I guess our sense that we live in a Mayberry has been shattered, and that we've crossed the fourth wall. On the other hand, I think that this is that all of the forces of inertia are against change, and all of the forces of invested power, invested interests are militating against change. And you really, those of us who are doing this work and have been doing it sort of every day for many years, realize that there is not a single moment when anything happens easily. Nothing is given to us in terms of actually creating a more just and equitable system of public safety not in any village, not in any town, and not in any city. So every step of the way is difficult. But I will say the one thing that I have found a really fruitful focus for me, and a good fit and an intersection of my skills, is data. And, you know, we can't really have conversations and informed conversations about these things unless we really, unless we have a foundation, unless we understand what we are spending on policing, unless we understand what do the arrest patterns look like, how are people being policed in our towns and villages, what are the priorities of our police department, what are the performance metrics that drive how our officers work, what they do each and every day. Those priorities are very often, and the values of our police departments very often don't reflect the values of our villages and towns, because the leadership of our police departments the leaders often don't live in our villages and towns. And if they do, they might not be, you know, really in the cultural mainstream at this moment in our villages and towns. So ultimately for me, the goal is to have a community-led and community overseen police force. And that means a police force that asks the community, actively asks what the community's priorities are, what their concerns are, what their values are. The vast majority, or a great deal of policing time and effort and resources goes, for instance, to drug enforcement. You know, is that what we want? Is that our top priority? Is making sure that you know, people who use marijuana illegally are deterred from that. So I see what Mayo just posted a comment. Yeah, we also have like less than represented, demographically represented representative police officers. And I guess I'm somebody who doesn't feel, and I might be unusual in this way. I personally feel like I'm sort of like more looking for the right person in a role of a leader rather than a person with a particular set of demographics. But all these things are important. All these things are really important.
One more minute, Kathy.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, so I guess what I would say is that I feel like, fundamentally, for me, for those of you who are on committees, what I would say is the very first thing we have to demand is transparency, because we can't really, you can, our public officials and our electeds really have already been asking for transparency, because how do you oversee effectively any organization and hold it responsible, or even understand how efficient it is if you know nothing about its work? So immediately we must know that. So I guess my focus has really been on trying to peel back the layers and understand how our departments are working, how they compare with each other, how they compare with state averages and norms, how much we're spending, and just those very basic questions, so that then we can begin to ask ourselves, does this reflect our values and our desires as a community? And I guess I'll just leave it there. I look forward to everyone's questions, and I'm so appreciative that everyone came out tonight to talk about this.
Thank you, Kathy. That was great, fascinating, very interesting. I'm sure people are going to have many questions for you and our other panelists. I remind everyone, do use the chat for your questions and comments, because in a few minutes we're going to have a Q&A time when we will ask those questions of our panelists. And I suggest when you go to chat, post your questions to everyone, and that way the members of our organizing committee who are monitoring the chat will be able to see them and pick out the ones that they want to be sure to get to. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but post them to everyone. That'll be the most efficient process. So thank you again, Kathy. And now our third panelist is Mayo Bartlett. And Mayo actually has spoken at Repair in the past, back in the days when we used to meet in person. Remember when that was a thing? Maybe it will be again someday. And so delighted he's back with us today. He's a civil rights and criminal defense attorney and the principal attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett, PLLC. He worked for the county district attorney's office, for more than 10 years, served as a litigator in the Superior Court Trial Division prior to his appointment as the chief of the Bias Crimes Unit. He's provided hate crime training for the law enforcement community, and he works with community organizations and schools to ensure that hate crimes are properly identified, reported, and investigated. He co-founded Safe Passage, a youth law forum that brings issues of law and policy to the classroom. And he's also served as an adjunct professor of law at Pace Law School, where he taught moot court and lectured on ethics. And Mayo Bartlett is just someone who really knows a lot about what happens when human rights and the law meet the real world. And so it's very important that he's joining us tonight. And he, like Kathy, is a member of the Irvington Town Committee on Police Reform. I believe Mayo serving as their facilitator. So he's also very aware of how these local committees are working, or in some cases, perhaps not working. So Mayo, please take the floor and share with us at least as much of your wisdom as you can fit into 15 minutes.
Carl, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. It's good to see everyone. I hope everyone is well. And I just want to thank Ken and Kathy, and we have Kay O'Keefe also, and Maria Imperial. They're all working. Maria is co-facilitator for Irvington along with me, and Kay O'Keefe is a member there. And I appreciate everybody else's efforts, in particular, those of you who are serving in your local police reform effort. And I'm also the co-chair for the Westchester County Police Reform and Reimagining Task Force, along with Mr. Chamberlain, who is again on the accountability working group there. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about process and also just make the suggestion that each and every one of us has a role to play. And I would never diminish the voice that a Kenneth Chamberlain brings and the power that he brings, not only from what happened to his family, but the dignity and the vision and the strength that he has exhibited from that day, even before that day, but certainly from that day forward as he works to help other family members. And what I don't think he may have said was, he spends a tremendous amount of time comforting and addressing and advising other people who have lost loved ones to police. And certainly we need people like Kathy who are able to look at it from a budgetary perspective, because without that, we're lost. So everyone has something they can do. You may not be the person that wants to be front and center, but you can play a very pivotal role. And simply being here tonight helps us all to move forward. It gives us all strength. I'll talk to you a little bit first about what we did in the county. We've been meeting now for, I guess, 7 months now, and we've had probably over 100, well over 100 meetings. And we developed 6 working groups. And we looked at it from the perspective of the life of a police officer's career. And we did everything we could to make sure we balanced it as much as possible so that there were law enforcement representatives on each working group, as well as different stakeholders represented on each working group. And we started out with qualifications and recruitment, because that's how you start to find the people who ultimately will be your police officers. We went from that to training and equipment, because once you're hired, of course, you've got to go through the training. And in Westchester County, we're responsible for the police academy, which trains virtually all of the police officers who come into Westchester County to work as police officers. And then after that, we looked at policies and procedures. So there's a working group there which deals with the implementation of a code that you have to adhere to that basically codifies the training. And then we realized that not everybody's going to adhere to the training. So when someone doesn't adhere to the training and to the policies, there's got to be a model of accountability. And again, it was tremendous to have Kenneth Chamberlain working on that group. And he was an invaluable voice. And together with many other members of the community, we thought that it was important that we have a version of a civilian complaint review board, a CCRB, but not a CCRB that we're all familiar with. Not something where you have people and it has no enforcement power, or where you have a group of people appointed by the police department and maybe a county executive or a mayor. We were thinking about something that was very different, and looking at the fact that there are 43 municipalities, 43 departments, in the county, we needed something where each department would be able to refer its complaints to a centralized body. And so we considered an Office for Police Accountability, which would have subpoena power and which would have the ability to be independent of the county executive, independent of the Board of Legislators. It would be its own independent agency that doesn't answer to anyone else. And that would give us the neutrality where hopefully if there's a determination of wrongdoing, it would be accepted by the community. And if there was a determination that there was no wrongdoing, it would have been a full and fair hearing that the community could trust. And ideally, it would be something that the community could trust and officers who do the job well could trust. So we met with Brian Corr from NACOL, and Mr. Corr is the person who was responsible for President Obama's 21st Century Policing Report. And after listening to our proposed model, he advised us that to his knowledge, if we're successful, this would be the first countywide police accountability board of its kind in the country. Now, we're not so caught up in being the first. What we want to do is make sure that whatever we end up with functions and serves the purpose. And along the way, we found other reports and other efforts that had happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I'm sure if you keep going back, you'll find even more which were not successful. And they weren't successful because there was not the will to implement them. There was not the will to fortify them with enforcement capabilities. So it was a feel-good measure. That is not what we have in mind. So if you get to that accountability part, there has to be transparency. And when we look at the transparency, lots of times I'll find it, occasionally law enforcement officers will be a bit defensive when you talk about transparency. But transparency is not a negative. We're talking about truth and honesty and openness. So in my estimation, the truth is never negative. It just is what it is. And more often than not, you'll find that there are things that are being done that are pretty good that we're not aware of because it's not made available to the public. And normally you'll be told, well, you know, the police board knows this, or, you know, the town board knows. But the town board doesn't communicate regularly with the people who are there in your community. And then we'll talk about citizens, but it doesn't recognize that not everybody in the community is a citizen, and that a citizen's a term of art. And right now can be very divisive, and you can be here from Paris, France, and not be a citizen and live here for 20 years and work here and be a part of the community. So we wanted to make sure that we encompass the public itself in its entirety. Anybody who lives in the community, anyone who works in the community, anyone who's just passing through the community should have the same expectation from law enforcement as the oldest, wealthiest family that's in that community. And if we think about it, if you've ever left your state and went on vacation, let alone if you've ever gone to another country, generally we have an expectation that we're not going to be treated differently because we're not citizens of that country. We don't think, oh, well, if I walk outside, the police may take me and kill me. The police may kneel on my neck for 9 minutes because I'm an American and I'm in Barbados, so anything could happen. No, we go there with the expectation that we're going to be treated fairly. So we looked at all of these things, and we also looked at community engagement models. How do we interface with the community? What do we do? And as recently as today, we had a conversation about not what do we think that interaction should be, but what does the community think it should be? So that's a somewhat difficult thing to achieve the bigger the municipality is. But it does require having regular non-enforcement interaction with the community. And then we talked about things such as the term defund. And I happen to be a person that instead of saying what I'm against, I like to talk about what I'm in favor of. And I find that I get a lot more out of that. And that language is tremendously important. So I'm able to talk to a police officer, and maybe I can use one set of terms and have one result. But if I change the phrase a little bit, I can find out that they're with me. So if I was to ask an officer, Chief, would it be beneficial for you if we were able to give you the tools to be able to address bad actors in your department? Well, the answer is always yes. Every single time it's yes. Nobody's ever told me no. And then we start asking them, well, what would you do? How could you be more effective? And they give us the blueprint. They provide. They tell us things we weren't even aware of quite often, some of the impediments that we would not have known about. So, you know, I like to look at what we do need. And one of the things I think we need is a model that prevents the next Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. from losing his life on a medical call. So one of those things is, you know, look, why do the police automatically respond on a mental health call? Or as we represented the estate of Mohammed Ba. And Mr. Ba was shot and killed in the police by the police in New York City because his mother hadn't heard from him for a while and was concerned that he might not be okay. And they broke his door down, shot and killed him. Well, why do you really need armed police to go and determine whether he's all right? So we expanded our scope, and instead of limiting where we were going to look for these answers, we decided to not just look in New York State or Westchester County, but you know, we looked at all of the other states, and we looked at every other country that we could, and we found models that worked well. So we found Cahoots, which is out in Eugene, Oregon, where there are non-law enforcement people, members of the community, quite often volunteers, who go to people's homes and do well visits to make sure that they're okay if they have a mental health issue. We also met with our Director of Community Mental Health, Mr. Orth, and talked about restoring the budget to allow for crisis intervention teams so that you have mental health professionals embedded with the police if and when the police need to arrive. And generally that mental health professional is the point person. We stopped and looked at things that were happening in England and Japan, community resource officers who don't have guns, and they tend to be tremendously impactful and embed themselves in the community and are really members of the community. And it's a pathway to becoming a member of law enforcement. And when you stop and look at that, there are a lot of great models out there right now that allow you to be very, very successful and creative in terms of the manner in which we are approaching policing. And also some of it actually removes burdens that police should not have to have. So for instance, if someone has a heart attack and the police come or an EMT goes to your house, you don't expect the EMT to put a stent in and to give you a pacemaker. You're hopeful that that EMT can stabilize you until you get to a hospital. And then hopefully there's someone budget provided that can take care of you. So instead of saying, I want to defund the police, I'd say, you know, I want these services. I want to make sure that we engage in educational programs for our kids. I want to make sure that we have jobs. I want to make sure we don't have homeless, because if we're spending $6,200 per person per month to be in a homeless shelter, I'm sure I can find a house in almost any community in Westchester County, and certainly an apartment for them to be in. And so you'd be amazed at how often we're begrudged $1,000 a month for that same person to have an apartment, which, by the way, helps someone meet their mortgage requirements. But we don't bat an eye at spending the $6,200 for them to be in a homeless shelter where they receive no care whatsoever. And some of you will remember, I think his name was Philip Grant, was the man who ended up killing Conchetta Russo in the Galleria parking lot, probably more than a decade now, 15, 20 years ago. But he was one of those people. You know, he would not have been there if he had proper mental health care, if he had perhaps an apartment, maybe some resources, and there's a good chance that Mrs. Russo wasn't going to die there at that day. So when we start putting it in those terms, you'd be amazed at how often the police are on board with us. And you'd be amazed at how often they support much of what we are advocating for. And even if they may not be able to vote for it in public, in private, you'd be amazed at some of the great conversations we've had. So there's one more minute, Mayor. Thank you. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I mean, and I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg in the sake of time. But I think that also we have to understand that how essential it is for the police to really be members of the community. And every time I mention it, I just look at the kids, my kids, and the teachers they had. Many times those teachers didn't live in the community, but if you thought about that community, you thought about that teacher. So if you wanted the embodiment of Valhalla, you know, you'd think of Coach Rich. Now, nobody knows if Coach Rich lived there anymore, but he was more involved in the community than half the people who've lived there for their entire lives. He loved the community and the kids loved him. So those are the kinds of relationships officers should have to have. So we're looking at training changes, which will now require community engagement. And it won't be this officer does it well, but that should be a requirement in order for you to have the job. You have to love the people. You can't be a police officer, can't be a district attorney or a judge and dislike the people. Find another job, find another career. But it's up to us to become well-versed in what we're talking about and to have enough information so that the next time someone's running for election in our community, the primary consideration is not whether the golf course is going to create more traffic or there's a French school someplace. It's got to be something meaningful. And we've got to understand that, in my estimation, to the degree that the police are not a part of the community and the community doesn't view the police as such, we will continue to have these issues. I think that if we're a little creative, there are a number of different ways that we can address it. And my very last point, to Kathy's point, is that we generally advocate for community policing. So yes, Irvington is 100% Caucasian, but if you were to look percentage-wise, then Irvington more or less meets pretty close to what the village is. So does that mean that we don't want to have more diversity? No. To the degree that we can recruit people who are Spanish speaking, to the degree that we can have people of different backgrounds, if we can have people of different sexual orientation, sexual identity, that's great. All of those things, inclusiveness, I think, is a benefit and it enhances and strengthens the community. But we do have to be aware that language is important. So when we're led by phrases which may not necessarily always be appropriate in a given circumstance, it's important to recognize that, we do need balance. And I just thank you all for taking the time and for allowing us to come and give this presentation. I look forward to speaking with you all further.
Wow. Those are three powerful voices coming from different perspectives and offering different insights into what it's going to take to create the kind of police reform that we really need in Westchester and in our society. And the combination of those three voices has really already brought me to a new level of understanding of what the issues really are. So thanks to all three of you. A lot of wonderful comments and questions have been piling up in chat, and others are probably percolating in your minds right now. I want to turn the next part of the evening over to Janice Landrum and Lee Richardson, two of our organizing committee members who have been monitoring the chat. And Janice, if you would kind of moderate the Q&A section now and have Lee help you, we'll try to get answers to as many of the questions that you've raised in chat as possible. We do try to end our repair meetings by around 9 o'clock, and we'll honor that tonight, but that should give us enough time to get to a lot of your questions.
Great, thank you very much. I've learned so much already. And Bartlett, it was in many ways great to end with you because your message was hopeful. There were so many wonderful ideas there of kind of a vision of what we could have. I want to go back though to Mr. Chamberlain. Kenneth, you proposed that perhaps more centralized policing could help. And I wondered, how big a problem is the unions from town to town? We may have centralized training, but do we have a centralized union, or is each police department a separate union governing those officers?
You know, I can't really say
or advocating for them.
If the unions are all connected, you know, my dealings have been with the city of White Plains and their police union, who, you know, since the killing of my father, never once tried to reach out to even try to work with me. The city of White Plains, the police department itself, did not reach out and say, hey, let's work together. So as Mayo said, there are no more Kenneth Chamberlain seniors. But we know that police unions are very powerful. You know, I will say that, and that is one of the reasons with some of these prosecutors is that they're looking for the support from these police unions around election time. So they don't want to go against these police unions. Mayo often talks about one time when we went into the district attorney's office to look at some of the evidence regarding the killing of my father, and one of the prosecutors had a PBA mug sitting on their desk. Can I honestly believe that I'm going to get full transparency in the killing of my father? Absolutely not. So, you know, we do know that the police unions are powerful.
Yeah. And I have one more question for you before we move forward to some other questions. Kathy made us think about how important data is. Have you learned that your father's horrible, horrible situation is somewhat isolated in White Plains, or is this the kind of thing that happens with frequency in our county?
Well, you have people like Danroy DJ Henry, Pace University football student killed. You have Raynette Turner killed in Mount Vernon, died in police custody in Mount Vernon. You have Kamal Flowers, who was just recently killed last year in New Rochelle. You have Samuel Cruz. I believe Mr. Cruz was in New Rochelle as well. You have Jonathan Maldonado in Greenberg. You know, this is the problem. They want you to believe that these are isolated incidents. They want you to believe that this doesn't happen in Westchester County, you know, and this is why families that are impacted by police violence in Westchester, we say Westchester County has its own George Floyd's too. And this is one of the reasons why we urge people who are standing on the front lines and you're fighting to get accountability. Don't just say justice for George Floyd. Don't just say justice for Breonna Taylor. Say justice for Kamal Flowers. Say justice for Jonathan Maldonado. Justice for Raynette Turner, Samuel Cruz, DJ Henry, because they want you to talk about incidents that are happening hundreds of miles away, not the ones in your own backyard. And that's how they don't have to be held accountable.
Thank you very much. I understand we've got a lot of questions to get to. Would you like to feed me one?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna ask Father Kevin, who wanted to make a comment about being on the Briarcliff Committee, to share some thoughts here, because there have been a number of people who have asked questions about whether whether policing, in your view, the view of the three panelists, is better controlled at the county level or at the town level. Because thinking of Kathy, the story of Irvington, right, how would that have been different if the county were overseeing that kind of case? So, Kevin.
Sure. For me, I'm in Briarcliff, and I've only been in Briarcliff I've only been in the north for 9 months. I moved here from Savannah, Georgia, which is a very different city. The population is just infinitely different. And I actually worked with the homeless population downtown, and now I'm at All Saints in Briarcliff. So my experience has been catching up with the culture here, but I've been on the police reform committee, and we've had a number of challenges. One has been, for me, having these very sensitive and important conversations over Zoom really fall short, at least from my experience of facilitating. But we also had some issues in the beginning with the outgoing police chief, who was an older gentleman, just kind of living in a place of disbelief that things happen in Briarcliff. And I think he represents a lot of folks in Briarcliff. And we had people on our panel sharing actual experiences that they had. And so we got really stuck in the weeds for the first couple meetings, and I think we got behind, but he actually announced that he was retiring, and our meetings have gone much better after that, to be completely honest. But one of the things that I think will be positive is similar to Kathy's experience with the statistical data. They just weren't keeping very good statistical data. And I think this has inspired Briarcliff to actually keep those kinds of keep that sort of data and post it publicly on a regular basis. And I mean, my hope, and this would, I think Mayo probably could speak to this. My hope is better training, because Briarcliff uses a policy that's put together by a large corporation called Interpol, which I suspect quite a few of the local smaller municipalities use. You know, and it seems like it's fairly good. They're more about liability. So whether or not they're doing it for the right reason, maybe they do the right thing. But for me, what I'm hoping, and I was speaking to the other clergy person on the committee this morning about this, is for a broader training, because words on a page mean nothing if you're not trained in them. But Briarcliff's been an interesting, the process with our committee has been very interesting. I mean, probably pretty similar to Irvington, the demographics, I suppose. Like I said, I'm still new, I don't know, but that's been my experience.
Thanks, Kevin. I noticed in the chat as you were talking that Carolyn Black from Ossining said she had been stopped in Briarcliff before. And I know our previous rector, who was Black, was also stopped in Briarcliff. And I want to throw it now back to Kathy for a second. You had some ideas about policies, like recording those stops that they said that they did not record in the past. Have you been successful, Kathy, in getting them in Irvington to record those stops, the ones that don't result in arrest?
Yeah, so our police reform committee actually only started working together maybe 5 weeks ago. So we're really behind. So we haven't, we have begun to discuss some of these policies, but in a, not in, I guess what we're doing is we're going like sort of one by one, and as at each juncture I sort of say, hey, but really the easier way to introduce these kinds of policies is to look at models that are out there, or that have been proposed at the state level, that really address a lot of these issues and try to get them adopted through either your local police reform process, or as the police reform process continues after April 1st, which it will, to continue to push for these. And so one of them is a policy that recently passed in New York State called the Police Stat Act, which requires actually that, that municipalities maintain records, including demographic records of every police stop that results in an arrest or a violation, and reports those out and makes them available to the public. So I guess what I would suggest other municipalities do, and what I think I'm going to work on in Irvington as our committee's work goes forward, is to insist that that be expanded to include stops that don't result in a violation or arrest. So every time an officer stops somebody, that there's a record, and that record is reportable out to the public.
Thank you.
It doesn't have to be specific, or it can be anonymized or aggregated, but so there, well, to avoid privacy issues. But yes, that should be done.
Thank you. Lee, what else do we have?
Somebody wanted to know, I'll read the question. I've been trying to learn from my town's budget how much is spent on settlement fees paid out for police misconduct. Where in the budget can I find such settlement fees?
So generally speaking, the research shows that typically that those costs are not charged against the police department's budgets, which is one of the reasons that there's less of an immediate incentive to modify the policing policies or practices. They often come out of the general budget, and or other parts of the general budget. I think that one of the questions that we need to interrogate, and maybe one of the other panelists can speak to this, is how liability insurance is structured for municipalities, and whether or not those costs end up absorbed into liability insurance costs.
Well, as it currently stands, many municipalities are self-insured, certainly larger ones. Others have insurance. But what happens is generally if there is a settlement or a finding against the municipality pays on behalf of the officer, and that's it. And so there is a proposal that was adopted by the county that the state should adopt legislation which would require the police officers to indemnify the municipality. So for instance, if the municipality pays out $5,000 because of your reckless or intentional act, that you would have to pay that back and indemnify the municipality. By the same token, if it's $5 million, then you are on the hook for that $5 million. And my thought process on it is that if that were the case, you're much less likely to think it's fun to kneel on someone's neck for 8 minutes, because that would mean your home and your pension. And I think your fellow officers would also be more likely to intervene because they have no interest in losing their homes or their pension. So that's one thing that we had contemplated in terms of revisiting the manner in which liability is meted out. And ultimately, if you're self-insured, for instance, with White Plains, if we win the case in the Chamberlain case, well, if Mr. Chamberlain lives in White Plains, he's paying part of whatever the settlement is or the verdict. And there's something obscene there. So that's just one of the things that we've contemplated.
Thank you. Lee, do we have another question?
No, I'm going to actually read it. It's more of a comment from Dennis Parker, but I'd like the panelists to maybe respond. Dennis asks, can you achieve meaningful police reform without an acknowledgement by law enforcement that there are serious problems of discrimination that have long been and continue to be present?
Well, I would say yes. And one of them would be what we just discussed. If you impose that kind of financial incentive, I think that they will address it, and they may be racist, they may have whatever they carry in their heart, but ultimately, if they know it's going to hit them in their pockets, they'll probably modify behavior. The other thing we talked about was a licensing requirement, which would require all police officers to have a license, as we require nurses and doctors and electricians and barbers and plumbers to have. And if you're not able to maintain that license based upon findings of misconduct or based upon a conviction of a crime, then you lose that. And that takes you off the list of eligible police officers. So it doesn't really matter what collective bargaining was or how powerful your union is. You're no longer eligible. Just as if I'm not eligible to practice law anymore. My law firm would have very little use for me at that point. They wouldn't keep me on. I certainly wouldn't have the ability to go to court and try cases on people's behalf.
I think I just want to add just one other piece to that. You know, one of the things that I always talk about when we speak about police reform, we always hear people talk about training, retraining officers, but training is not the end all be all. Do we need training? We most certainly do. In any profession, you need training. You need to be up to date. You need to know the latest ways of dealing with situations. I often say that a police officer's job is to diffuse a situation, not create one. And sometimes it's the language that we use. For instance, you say defense tactics instruction, but not crisis management, which, you know, if you look at it, it's the same thing. Defense tactics could be included in crisis management, but they'll just talk about the defense tactics aspect of it. And the bottom line is holding officers accountable. Having prosecutors in place that when these police officers commit these egregious acts, they are charged. And that's when you'll start to see reform. That's when you'll start to see change. Because now these officers will say, wow, there's a DA that's in office, or there's a prosecutor in office that's not playing, that they really believe in the rule of law.
Yes, thank you.
Those are just three things. There are many more that we could talk about that also would allow us to do that without having to change hearts and minds per se.
Thank you. Lee, do you have another question?
Yep. Ken, and you may, well, you may not be able to take both these, but somebody wanted to know what the current status of the police involved in your case is. I think you said it's being reheard, so you may or may not be able to comment on that. And then sort of a follow-up, same person asked, what would you envision as being justice served for your family based on the tragedy you've experienced?
So I'll let Mayo answer the first piece, since he is one of my attorneys. I'll let him answer the first piece about the police officers, and then I'll answer the second.
Some of the officers have retired. Some were promoted. One passed away. Matter of fact, the officer that was allegedly the one who used a racial slur against Mr. Chamberlain died in a car accident shortly before the trial.
Okay, and I guess as far as we're talking about what justice looks like for my family, after a 10-year fight and still in this this fight with the city of White Plains, I don't know if there'll ever be justice for Kenneth Chamberlain. That's a very hard thing to say. because it hurts that, you know, I lost my dad the way that I did. But I can only say that justice now will come in the form of accountability. And that means putting laws and mechanisms in place to make sure that this doesn't happen again to any other family. I don't want you to know what it feels like to have someone tell you that your loved one was shot and killed by law enforcement and they did nothing to warrant it. So I guess that if there's going any semblance of justice, I guess, like I said, it's just inaccountability. Yeah. It's trying to, this is why I sit on this task force. You know, this is why I meet with other families. This is why I stand with them, because we want to see real positive change. And, you know, currently you have a New York State Attorney General that most families that are impacted by police violence have zero confidence in. Letitia James has done nothing for families that have been impacted by police violence. So this is, again, it comes back to us coming to individuals such as yourself and asking you for help, asking you to help us push the agenda of forcing positive change in these cities, because she's certainly not going to do it.
This is very frustrating in light of how much we've gathered tonight and how much we've learned and all the questions you all have, but it's 9 o'clock. And so I'm afraid that I need to turn it over to the people who are going to end the program. Is the next person that I've changed screens. Carl, can you keep me honest?
Sure. Thank you, Janice and Lee, very much for doing such a great job of moderating the questions. And Ginny, I think you have a couple of just kind of final announcements before a closing prayer.
Right. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Mayo. What an incredibly powerful evening. I can't thank you enough for launching what I'm sure will be a series of conversations at Repair about policing and what it needs to be in our communities and how we can advocate for that. So thank you so much again for being a powerful launch for us in this topic. So my official closing comments have to do with people who'd like to stay involved and keep in touch with us. So if you're not already on our newsletter, please send a request to info@repairrivertowns.org and we can add you to updates which don't come frequently, just on monthly e-newsletters, it says here, and we can keep you up to date about our next meeting and topics, etc. You could also go out to Facebook and like us there. There's a lot of great posts around this topic and others that are posted there. So please do that as well. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'd like to turn it over to Father Kevin for our closing prayer this evening. Thank you.
All right, pray with me. Almighty God, who created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may be reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations. To the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. We loved having you here. We'll look forward to seeing you at next month's meeting.
And check our Facebook page. There will probably be additional resources there in the coming days for any of your friends who were not able to be here tonight.
Thank you very much, everyone. Best wishes.
Thank you
all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ginny. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Great evening.
Great job.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee.
Oof, that was tough.
I wish we had more time.
Yeah.
There were so many good questions we didn't get a chance to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if we, did somebody download the chat? So before
I did.
Okay, great. Because I'm wondering if we might be able to go back to Kathy and Mayo and Kenneth and pose some of those questions and keep the conversation going forward.
Yeah. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Great.
Let's try to do that.
Great, thank you.
I saw a lot of course, familiar faces, but some new ones too, which is always nice.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay.
Everybody.
Good night.
Good night, guys.